think we're live.
I think we are live without countdown music.
That's good too. If you're joining us, thank you for joining us for our third constitutional conversation. Today, we are going to be going over Articles 4 through 7. If you missed our prior conversations, we've already done Article 1 and then we've done Articles 2 and 3. You're welcome to go back and watch those. They've been recorded. You can find them on our Facebook, on our YouTube, various of our social media networking places. But today we're going to be talking about 4 through 7. So we're going to take a couple minutes and let people log in. Please feel free to put your comments in the chat. If you're out there, please say hi. Tell us where you're from. We would love to see you there. And while you're doing that, we're going to tell you who we are and where we're from. So I'm Sarah Santana. I'm the State Director for Convention Estates, Michigan. I live in West Michigan, just west of Grand Rapids, in a wonderful little place called Allendale. And I am really happy to be here tonight. I'm going to pass the baton to Don. Don, you want to tell us who you are and what you do and all that?
Yep, Don Regan. I'm part of the legislative liaison team, and I'm also from West Michigan, a little bit south of Grand Rapids, a little farming community called Caledonia. And I love the concept of convention estates because we are trying to rein in the power of the federal government.
Yeah.
So
Jim, you want to jump in there?
Yep. My name is Jim Chrismanek. I'm from the western part of the Upper Peninsula. I'm the district captain up here, and I've been on board for a couple of years, and anyways, just enjoying it. And we got to get our resolution passed and join the other 19 states that are on board.
100%. 100%. Kurt
O'Keefe, St. Clair Shores, just north of Detroit. Been in politics since 1972. I used to think we just need the right people and it'll work out. And in the 80s and 90s, I realized we need structural reform. We have to change the structure. We will never get the right people. James Madison, if men were angels and so on, we wouldn't need these rules.
Yep.
And as we all know, the rails that were set up by the founders to constrain the federal government have been expanding. So I schmooze legislators, seems like all the time, establish relationships and try to move that needle to get us to be a passed state.
Yeah. Tyler.
Hi, everybody. I'm Tyler Engelmeyer. I am a district captain out of Troy, just north of Detroit. I was previously a district captain in Indianapolis, just on the south side. Hoping to have Michigan be a passed state and join Indiana and the others as well.
Robin.
Hi, everybody. My name is Robin Riddell. I am the State Communications Coordinator, and I have a great team who helps us produce information and educational opportunities like this one to help our Michigan community. And I live in the small town of Fenton, Michigan, which is just south of Flint. I've been with the organization for about 3 years. I've learned a lot. I continue to learn a lot, and I am passionate about getting this done.
So while we're going through the Constitution, if you would like to read along with us, there is a Constitution that you can download. Robin, where can they find that?
There's a link, or you can grab that QR code on there and you can download a PDF of it. It is, well, you can see it there. You don't need me to read it for you, but it is a free download, or snatch that with your QR code reader.
Wonderful. All right. Well, if you're in the audience, please leave us a comment, leave us a like, share with your friends so they can join in. We're going to be jumping right in now to Article 4. All right. So Article 4 has 4 sections. Section number 1 is really focused on giving authority to the federal government. It says full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state, basically meaning that everything the federal government does is going to apply to the entire country. And that would be, of course, very important. Then Section 2 covers the privileges of the.
Actually, I have to interrupt. That's not what it
Go ahead.
means.
All right, go ahead.
It says each state gives full faith and credit to the other states, which means if you get divorced in Michigan and you move to Indiana, you're not married. And that was a problem with the Articles of Confederation. So full faith and credit, if you got a judgment against you in Michigan and you move to Indiana, they have to give the full faith and credit to the proceedings of every other state.
You're right. I missed the every other state at the end of that. And I even had it highlighted too.
Oh,
So,
well, I'm a lawyer. I'm a lawyer. I probably left that out. So that.
yes. Yes. No, thank you, Kurt. Thank you. Section 2 covers the privileges of citizens that will exist throughout all the states. They can't have one state where they don't have those privileges and immunities that they have in a different state under the federal. Anything I got wrong there, Kurt?
Well, just don't forget to mention criminals and fugitives too.
Right.
Oh,
well,
yeah.
what that's talking about, again, it's more of a state to state thing, which says,
Yes.
again, the Articles of Confederation, you can't in Massachusetts have no sales tax, but you got a 10% sales tax on non-Massachusetts residents or things like that. So they're trying to balance that, evening things out with the federal system that was perceived as entirely too weak, but keeping the federal balance, the state federal power.
Right, right. And then it goes on to talk about, as you said, Dawn, harboring criminals. States were not allowed to harbor criminals from other states. If the state said, hey, you've got a criminal over there, they had to be turned over to the state that had jurisdiction of the crime that criminal had committed. Then there was a section regarding basically slaves having to be returned to their slave owners in other states. That was amended by the 13th Amendment, which we will cover in more detail next week. But we may get into that in our discussion a little bit as well. And then if we move on here to Section 3, we start talking about the admittance of states into the country. Because, of course, we started with 13, and they had a whole bunch of extra land that they anticipated there were going to be more states. So the admittance of new states was the authority to do that was given to Congress. The authority was also given to Congress to have some say in the forming of new states that encompassed land that existed within existing states. So you couldn't take part of your land and say, I'm going to make a new state out of this. That had to have Congress's approval as well as the legislature of the state that the land belonged to. If you were trying to take part of more than one state and combine it into a state, that also required Congress and the legislatures of all the states involved. Then we have Section 4. I'm going to move right along to Section 4. If I miss something, we'll get back to it, where we talk about the guarantees that the United States is making to the states themselves. It guarantees them a Republican form of government within each state, protection from invasion, as well as protection against domestic violence. So that is Article 4. I'm going to open it up. What do you guys want to talk about?
Kurt, we got you muted.
Yeah, Article 2 there was start of the Civil War was return of property if the slave was property. And then the Dred Scott decision in 1858, followed by the attack on Harper's Ferry, and that really precipitated it, which also fits in with some of the state things. Maine was part of Massachusetts until 1820. And that was the Missouri Compromise as this tension of free and slave. And so Missouri was admitted as a slave state and Maine as a free state. I'm not sure how Vermont got in. I didn't get into that. But then Article 4, I've always had the question about West Virginia was part of Virginia. All of Virginia seceded, but we didn't recognize the secession. That was the Civil War. The western counties of West Virginia said, we don't want any part of that slave state. And they were admitted in 1863, obviously without the consent of the Virginia legislature. Now, nobody's going to undo that, but it is kind of a question about did West Virginia really become a state? And then, as you pointed out, Sarah, Kentucky, Tennessee, if you look at the borders in 1787, they just went indefinitely west. There was no line from the Carolinas or Virginia.
Yep.
So Kentucky got in, I think, 1790, Tennessee. They anticipated, and Congress was in charge of admitting new states. And as you said, well, if you're going to take out part of a state, any part of a state, the state has to also agree to it. So yeah, these things have maybe lost some significance over time. And Don's point, Don, here's your point, DC being a state.
Yeah. That's
Go into that now.
so there's been 3 times where, DC started off as a 10 by 10 square. And since then, in the past 100 years or so, it's rescinded part of its territory. So now it's kind of an oblong or irregular shape. It's no longer a square. And so the surrounding states have reclaimed some of that territory due to basically it's Congress had to approve these things. So a lot of it went back to Virginia. And what the people of DC are trying to do now is make themselves an actual state before their territory gets reclaimed by Maryland. So that was what I was trying to do, was trying to get that stuff back to Maryland versus have it become its own state. If you drive around DC, you'll see a lot of their license plate covers say no taxation without representation. So they're making that claim to justify a move to make DC a standalone 51st state.
And it's a move of the National Democrat Party more than a grassroots thing. When Johnson was president, it required a constitutional amendment to give DC 3 electoral votes, which could have decided, Bush, Gore, or even this year, some of the other years.
Was that in 63?
Yes, it was effective for the first time in the 64 election when it didn't really matter.
Yeah.
Washington, D.C. now gets a non-voting representative.
Yes.
But the whole city is governed by, there's a committee in Congress that deals with all of it, and Congress passes all their local laws, their city ordinances, which I think is, well, I don't know. I was going to say a waste of Congress time, but that's pretty much what they do anyway. So Don had the brilliant idea of bringing this up at our simulated convention and I've seen other proposals to put part of it in Virginia and part of Maryland. How much would be left? Hardly any people. If you put all just the federal buildings, it's not that big of an area.
So I wanted to find out, all right, what's their plan if they actually want to become a state? Their notion is to shrink the boundaries surrounding the federal buildings around DC, and the remaining territory will become the state of Columbia. And then there'll still be a DC, but it'll be so small, just a few city blocks. And so my notion was for let's instead of having it become Columbia, why don't we just rescind it back to the state of Maryland the way Virginia reclaimed its territory from earlier parts?
And there
Just
was a reason
clarify for the viewers, this isn't technically germane to our Article 5 resolution, correct? This doesn't fall within the bounds.
and that's
of our
how the chair
free
rules.
Yeah. If a wise enough commissioner can make a
Don't
choice.
muddy the waters. Don't muddy the waters.
But let's go back to why was it set up? And it was a swamp. I mean, that's what happened. It was a 10 by 10 swamp. It was partly a compromise between the North and the South.
Yeah.
The North didn't want the capital in a slave state, and the South didn't want it in a free state.
Right.
And this was the last big, I think, block issue that was negotiated.
Compromise.
And you're a compromise. Thank you. And so what they set it up. Also, do you want the capital to be in New York or Chicago, where the left local government takes it over and they have all the workers and they go on strike, and in effect they could shut down the federal government. You want to have those issues, and those have not been an issue until the last few years, but it's very obvious now. As Don said, you're setting up what they call the Portland Free Area of BLM.
Oh, the Chaz. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you want that to happen around the
Yeah,
Senate,
right,
the Supreme Court,
right.
the Capitol, the Supreme Court, and the White House. So those were perceived as possible type threats, and now they seem more real than ever.
All right, let's go back to the first part of Article 4, where it talks about privileges and immunities in all the states. So what was the origin of or their intent for this clause?
There was so much trouble and competition between the states. So maybe in Boston, it's like, well, if you live in Massachusetts, there's no tariff. But if you live in Connecticut, then if the property is going to Connecticut, you have a different privilege that would come under that, where they're giving a preference to residents of their state, which inhibits it has all kinds of negative consequences. I'm not sure in terms of, I think immunities would be, well, the people in Massachusetts are free to beat up anybody from Vermont.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, and there were many violent conflicts when the articles were going on.
Yes.
Because of these rules, you had really confiscatory type taxation and restraints of trade, where that was perceived as a need to be put in there. I'm not sure there's been much litigation on this lately, although I think it might come up because California had proposed they want to tax anybody that has been in California.
Oh, that's
not even work, or if you work for Apple, that's in California. So there was a bill introduced to tax you. And that gets to be a question of, well, wait a minute. If you live in California and work for Ford, Michigan doesn't get your income.
That's correct.
Tax. So that it's interesting that some of these boundaries that were set have been respected and established, but really more and more of them are under attack.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Joseph Story said he was a Supreme Court justice back in 1840. He said regarding the privileges and immunities, so no state can show preference to any native citizens. Otherwise, it would, or therefore, then it would just guarantee that there would be no jealousies or discontents between the citizens of the different states, which would have been very injurious to harmony.
Mm-hmm.
So he stated it quite eloquently.
So you couldn't, for example, give preference and permits to people who have lived in your state for longer over people who have just moved there, that sort of thing.
Well, they didn't want jealousies. So think of state A looking over the boundary, and state B has gotten preferences because of their laws, which is injurious to any surrounding neighbors. And so now you've got these jealousies that are brewing up, and it causes the lack of harmony between all the states. And that's the framers had their foresight to try to eliminate.
It's a complete barrier. You can't get a license to do whatever unless you lived here 3 years. You can't get this. So what happens is they're passed to increase the cost to everybody else to the benefits, the concentrated benefits diffuse costs issue. But what it did is it was just stopping all kinds of trade, or who doesn't have a coast?
Mm-hmm.
I think all the 13 original had some kind of coastline, but maybe somebody at one state, they're close. You move across the state line to get to the river, and it's like, well, the boats registered in our state don't have to pay anything, but the other ones have to pay to use the river, or they have to pay to get a portage around the bridge, or use, there wasn't a lot of rail travel.
Mm-hmm.
All of those things existed. All those types of things existed.
Mm-hmm. So if we look back at section 3, I was thinking about it. when it comes to the creating of new states and basically the adjusting of state boundaries, I believe it's what is it? Oregon. It's Eastern Oregon is trying. There's a bunch of counties that are trying to join Idaho. Have you heard of that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's been several moves along all the West Coast states.
Yeah. Northern
California
California.
wants to break into 2 or 3 states.
Yeah.
Oregon wanted to make a new state or join Idaho. Washington has the same thing, which lines up with you have a lot of the population in the concentrated, what we call blue areas or metropolitan areas that have completely opposite interests. And it's really this point that you're making, Sarah, which is all of the farmers don't want to be paying taxes to support the people getting free Wi-Fi in Traverse City or which we have now. And those type of things are like, well, wait a minute. It's part of the polarized 2 different worlds we live in. But the Oregon legislature will not agree to that because it's dominated by the Portland and the urban vote. So
I heard there was a chance because they would actually not lose that much in the ways of they would basically keep most of their voice in Congress because the population was so small in the rest of the state, and they would be able to keep a lot of the money that gets sent out to the rural areas. So I heard that they
but they
actually
wouldn't be able to tax those rural areas. That's that's follow the money. They would.
Do you think they pull that much in from the farmers?
How much does it have to be? I mean, there's very few politicians who say we have enough revenue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They wouldn't. I don't think I don't think it would. They'd still have 2 senators that have more solidly blue congressional districts. They might only lose like 1 or 2. So that I don't think is their concern. There's so much. Again, this is why we're all here at the Convention of States. There's so much. What is the federal basis of coming back? Is it a bunch of price supports that the farm areas that leave are getting? Does it play off regulations that affect a particular industry in the state? Because they're wildly different.
So, Jim, is the UP still trying to become the 51st state?
I've looked into that a little bit, and I also it doesn't sound realistic right now. I don't think they're going to get either state or Congress support. At one time, we had the minerals up here that were being developed in that, and of course that brought a lot of wealth to our state. But that isn't being developed right now. Very small amounts are. So yeah, things have changed. And
the copper mines closed. There was a movement. Well, some people spoke about calling it the 51st State Superior, and they were going to send a white pine stump to the Senate to represent them. That was probably in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. But if you line it up, it's like Scotland talking about getting out of the UK. The UP gets a lot more tax revenue than it pays in. So economically, it doesn't make sense. Yeah, and it's flipped back and forth. It was solidly Democrat with all the miners and union voters. So. But yeah, that good question, Don. I remember that one. The state of Superior.
So the only active mine we have is Eagle mine in Marquette area, anyways, that I know of. And
that's one iron mine. That's all that's left operating.
Well, it's copper and also cobalt. I think it's cobalt.
Yeah, cobalt. Yeah.
Oh.
But that's the only one that's active. Although there are other areas that are still trying. I think there's copper mine over by in the Okanagan area, on the Wisconsin Okanagan border. Anyways,
yeah, they closed. They didn't give the union what they wanted, and they said we can't pay it. That we'll have to close. And they said they went on strike and they closed the mine, and that was decades ago.
Yeah, well,
yeah,
first state Superior.
Yeah. Well, so Section 3 guarantees that the federal government is essentially going to guarantee all of the states have a Republican form of government, which I thought was interesting that they actually point blank said it, because we do have a bit of a social experiment with all the freedom that the states have. But I guess we can't have true tyranny in any state according to that.
Yeah, you don't
Well,
want
we
New
want-
York to reclaim the monarchy while we're trying to be a Republican.
Right. Right. Or they didn't want the dictator. I mean, we went to a tiny army. After
Mhm.
10 years after, there was like 3,000 in the whole United States Army. It wasn't even named the Army. So they didn't want some dictator in Kentucky's a new state, and they get all the frontiersmen out, and he's the generalissimo. I mean, that would be a threat to the other states. So
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And just real quick, because for those of you who are watching this, I asked our esteemed panel here about the use of the word domestic violence before we got started. It says that the United States guarantees that they will, when necessary, protect us against domestic violence. Do you guys want to jump in and explain the meaning of domestic violence in that context and time period? Jim?
Oh, me?
You're the
Oh,
one with the dictionary.
well, my definition was in context, acts of violence occurring within a nation.
Mhm.
They were concerned about actual violence within the nation as a whole.
I think it was directly inspired by Shays' Rebellion, if I remember correctly.
Mm.
All right, now here's a question. Would Black Lives Matter or Antifa or the Capitol Hill Autonomy Zone, Chaz, would that fall under this definition of domestic violence?
Well, I would assume the riots would fall under domestic violence on some level.
That's what I mean. So they used violence to establish the Capitol Hill Autonomy Zone. They used illegal violence to do that. And so the legislators in that area could not do their job of instituting a Republican or executing a Republican form of government.
yeah, you're talking about
Took over.
You're talking about Portland.
Yeah, Portland. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think there's been many more occasions where it could have been used. The Army was called out for draft riots in the Civil War and fired on American citizens. And I was here I was within very easy listening distance of the bullets going off in the Detroit riots in July '67. The National Guard was called out and 15,000 federal troops were sent in. The Democrat mayor and the Republican governor asked Democrat President Johnson to send troops, and there were U.S. tanks in the streets, and they were not aimed at Windsor, Canada, across the river. So that's, I think, looking at Jim's given the definition is just very simple. There's foreign invasion, and there's basically what would be a domestic invasion. And to answer Don's question, I think all of those would have justified calling out troops.
I think so. I think Chaz is in violation of the U.S. Constitution because they no longer were executing a Republican form of government.
Right, but if nobody, if the president, whose constitutional duty, do you do that? Faithfully execute the laws.
Yes. Yeah. Good point. Good point.
Interesting. Okay, so let's move on to Article 5.
Our favorite.
Our favorite. I know this is the one that has the least highlighting of all my notes. So I was like, I'm good on that one. So Article 5, for those of you who are not familiar with Article 5, is the Convention of States article. It's the one that establishes how we can have amendments proposed and adopted to the Constitution. And two methods are given. The first is Congress. Congress, with support of 2/3 of both the House of Representatives and the Senate, can propose an amendment, which is then sent back to all 50 state legislatures for ratification. If 3/4 of the state legislatures say, yeah, we like it, it's awesome, it becomes law of the land and is added to the Constitution. That's the first method. Second method is for 2/3 of the states legislatures to say, we want to get together and propose an amendment on a given topic. If they all agree that they all want to do that on that given topic, again, 2/3, that's 34 states, then that will go to Congress. They'll set a time and date. The convention will happen. All 50 states can send people to propose those amendments. Amendments that make it through that convention are then sent back to all 50 states for ratification. And again, you need 3/4, 38 states to make it law of the land. So those are the two methods that are given for us to amend the Constitution. There are a few things that are added at the end of this. One is that they say, provided that no amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the first and fourth clause in the ninth section of the first article. Both of those clauses are related to slavery. One was related to your ability to bring in people to the country without, I believe, being taxed. You guys can look that up and make sure I'm right. And so that was very important, in particular to slave owners who were bringing in slaves at that time. And the second one is regarding taxing people in the state, basically a per person tax. So both of those things they did not want addressed before that given year. The second thing that they add on is that no amendment can be made without consent that would deprive a state of its equal suffrage in the Senate. So they couldn't make it so the states did not have equal representation in the Senate through an amendment. And of course, that was very near and dear to the hearts of the states because this was a big sticking point when they were coming up with the structure of our government, as we talked about with our first meeting on Congress, that there were states that wanted to have equal representation. There were states who wanted to have more representation because they were larger. And so the states that obviously wanted to make sure they maintained equal representation would have been very, very concerned about an amendment being made that would take that away. I will open up Article 5 to the panel.
Yeah, the mnemonic, the memory device that sticks with me is 34, 26, 38. 34 states is 2/3, and then each state has one vote. It takes 26 out of 50 to propose an amendment. And we have 99 state legislatures because Nebraska went unicameral as a cost-cutting measure in the Depression. So to be ratified, both houses have to ratify in the other 49 states, meaning, as Mark Meckler says, it only takes 13 out of 99 legislative bodies to block any amendment. There has to be a real overwhelming consensus. And I think, Don, you have all this data on how many compacts and multi-state conventions and how many Article 5s. I think you usually can.
Yeah, but I'm interested in the foundation of, or what was their method of getting this article agreed upon, because it has a bit of a history. During the month of September of the Constitutional Convention. So who knows the history of Article 5 during that, right before?
I do, and Sarah does, but go ahead.
So George Mason, 2 or 3 days before they convened or adjourned the Constitutional Convention, didn't like the fact that the proposed Constitution only allowed for the U.S. Congress to propose amendments. And so he added, and I can't remember the quote. Does somebody know the quote where there's going to be a point in time where the government will not be interested in proposing amendments to curtail their power. So therefore, he added the second path where the states could call for a convention to propose amendments. So my question to you, the panel, is how long during the summer of 1787 did that form of the Constitution, where it was just only the U.S. Congress could propose amendments, how long did that ferment in their notes before it got adjusted by George Mason?
Well, I think it was months, and I think Mason ended up voting against it anyway. the whole
Oh no,
document.
he voted against the Constitution, right?
Yeah, he voted against the
But
Constitution. But his,
did you
his
know
comment
that-
is, yeah, his comment is, hey, you're relying on these. The point of this is to restrain them from getting too big, and you're relying on them to restrain themselves, and that just is not going to work.
I know, but I'm interested in the dynamics of the group that was there, the framers, how they had to negotiate back and forth. On July 26th, the convention wanted to take a break, and so they adjourned. They had a little summer break, about 10 days worth. But not everybody went home. They called a mini committee to gather all the notes that had been taken, and they scribbled down on all the agreements that have been made up to that date, and put it in a decent form so that when they come back from adjournment or recess, summer recess, they could then begin to structure even more a cleaner foundation of what the Constitution was going to look like.
Well,
So
if they were old like me, Don, they were probably worried they'd forget where they
so
left off.
for 10 days, these guys were gone, and the small committee then grabbed all the notes, and they created 23 articles that kind of look like the Articles of Convention if you look at the list of them. And so I want to read for you Article number 19, and this is what it said on August 10th. On the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the United States for an amendment of this Constitution, the legislator of the U.S. shall call a convention for that purpose.
Mhm.
So they're talking about in August 10th, it was only the legislatures. And then somehow after August 10th, that got completely obliterated and replaced by the U.S. Congress to propose amendments. I did not know that. And nobody can, it got reversed completely. And then Mason on September 15th said, no, let's add back in the legislator. It was a legislator all summer long. The legislatures were going to call amendments. They were going to apply for a convention. And somehow in August, it got replaced by the U.S. Congress.
I think that being that this passed unanimously, Mason's added language, I think it left their consciousness because they were more concerned about the slave-free fights, the big state, small state, where's the capital, and how do we get this representation? We don't want the big states to dominate and have it all on population. And the big state says, well, we don't want to be even with the states that don't have the people. So my guess, and I can only guess, is they were more consumed with their bitter, divisive fights over that and running out of gas by September. The other thing is it was a lot warmer. In Philadelphia, there was yellow fever still at that time.
Yeah.
So when you get in July and there's no air conditioning, it's like they wanted to get the hell, pun intended, out of there for their health and comfort.
I've always wanted to ask Mark Meckler that, though, because he made sure that we all know that George Mason added the legislature call for a convention of states on September 15th, when all through June and July, it was already there, and it was only a convention of states as part of their original notes. And then somehow it got reversed after they came back from recess, and it was completely replaced by the U.S. Congress only proposed amendments. And that's when
we get this argument that it's never been used, but we were within a couple of states on direct election of senators. And as usual, the Congress puts their fingers to the wind and go, oh,
That's
there
right.
there go the people, and I must follow, for I am their
That's
leader.
right. Yeah.
And the same with limiting president to 2 terms. That was had a lot of wind in a lot of states, and they figured out it was going to pass. And they go, oh, wait, that's our idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the process has been successful. And
Yes.
the threat of the people taking over can inspire proper behavior.
Well, and
You're
our
right.
Constitution is such a balancing act. I think they were very focused on making a government that was functional, because the Articles of Confederation were not. But at the same time, they were very focused on making a government that would not run away and become what they had come from. And so you have these two pieces of functionality, but then also the ability to preserve freedom and liberty. And I think with our two different methods, that's really what you have. The first method of Congress really is more functional. It is much easier for Congress to propose an amendment. They're there, they can do it. You know, all you have to do is get a group of people in a room to agree, and boom, versus what we're trying to do with Article 5 is so belabored, getting legislatures in all these different states to do all these things. That's a very difficult task. But obviously, the second is there to allow for that checks and balances and the preservation of liberty that you wouldn't necessarily have with the first. So I think they really were doing this balancing act throughout the Constitution.
Well, they didn't. It's not easy to get 2/3 of Congress to do anything now. They anticipated it would be easier, and it was a much smaller group of people, of course, when they started. The other tension, Gordon Wood, as a great historian, Story of the Revolution and the book on the Constitution. There was actually, in the yin and yang of the universe, many of the founders wanted a much stronger executive. They didn't want the House to be number one with appropriations. They said, well, the thing about the king is he was over there. This Articles is terrible. We need a strong executive, as Don was saying, the New York and the Federalists, and it's like a lot of they didn't want that. They wanted a stronger executive. They wanted the executive to be the strongest branch. So that was a fascinating, I just learned that when I read that book in the last year. So these things aren't static. You read something that, well, Jefferson, you see one letter, he said every 25 years, the tree of liberty should be watered by blood. Well, hey, you know what? I'm 70. I haven't had the same position on every issue my whole life. And like Adams was for a very strong executive.
Yeah.
And a lot of them, the way they were setting up electoral college and state legislatures picking the senators is they wanted the smart people, as opposed to what are called maybe deplorables, to be picking these top executive and other leaders, the people could elect the House of Representatives. And the franchise, I think Don probably knows, I think you had to be a white male property owner who was 24 or older. So, and even with that, a lot of what would be called upper class now, they thought, well, we don't want to let too many people in on running the government because they'll just vote our property away.
Yeah.
So a lot of these are some of the tensions, obviously, that we still have with us. Look how afraid of us they are.
Yeah, that's right.
They are apps. They're just, I mean, we're in the middle of an election, but when we
Yeah,
got up
that's
to
right. That's why we have the 17th Amendment, because they were afraid of us back in 1912 before it got ratified.
This is a very long story. Yes, Don's got all the details on it. It was amazing. I think you looked up the 5 reasons, the 5 arguments for taking it away from the legislatures were to get money out of politics.
There's 4 of them, and it's we'll have to spend one of our weeks just talking about the year 1913. That's my vote is, so let's carve out one of these for the year 1913.
Yeah, because that covers the Federal Reserve, the income tax amendment, and the direct election.
Conan.
What that?
The Conan.
The Conan?
The Annotated Constitution.
Oh.
1913. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
That's a good year.
Yeah, Wilson said it was outdated.
It is. Article 6. Let's move into Article 6 because we still got to get through 6 and 7. I want to make sure we get.
Sarah.
All right. So 6 basically establishes that any debts that the country had prior to adopting the Constitution would still be held by the Constitution, by the country after adopting the Constitution. It also puts forth that basically the Constitution is the law of the land. And anything that came, any of the laws, the treaties that were made by the federal government, they had to be acknowledged through the entire country by the judiciary. Also, the executive, legislative, and judicial officers on both the state and federal level had to be bound by oath to support the Constitution. So they're really shoring up the bases here, making sure we know that this is going to be law of the land, and all y'all have to agree to support it. That's the new rule.
And don't forget the religious test.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Thank you very much. And no religious test can never be required as a qualification to hold an office. That was highlighted too. Did I read it? No. Thank you, Don.
Well, you have to be a member of the Church of England to be the Prime Minister of England to this day.
To this day.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Blair converted to Catholicism shortly after he got out of office. Disraeli was Jewish, but he converted to Anglican because he wanted to have a political career.
Ah,
Interesting. I didn't know that was still a thing.
Yep. Well, that's old. And that's part of, I guess, Don, would you call this the Hamilton article? Because Hamilton had so much of the debt. He wanted all of the debts to be.
yeah.
The reason it's in there is some people said, well, we're starting over. We don't have to pay all these
That's
war
right.
debts.
That's right.
These war debts that we're still paying off France all these years later. And probably some other, I think France was number one. Dutch also financed some of the revolution. Not to mention a lot of domestic people who went bankrupt because they didn't pay them back. So that was kind of the tension of, well, the easy way out is we'll just repudiate all that old debt. And there's parallels like the common law. The states passed statutes saying that the common law of England was adopted, meaning they were going to keep the same case law and basis of law that they had. So it's interesting how, yes, it was brand new. On the other hand, it was absolutely essential to keep some of these things going. Well, of course, the peace treaty was signed before the Constitution.
That's right.
End of the revolution. Well, you're not repudiating that.
That's right.
Mhm.
That's right.
And they wanted to say, here, everything, we're taking over everything
Mhm.
that went on before. We're not repudiating any of it. And
Well, they must have agonized back and forth to what they're going to do with this debt burden.
that was a big one.
Yes, and my guess is because they just did not want to burn the creditors because they knew that we had to have a solid foundation for future credit. So
And it had to come from overseas at that time.
true.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it was all paid off till the early 1800s. Is that?
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah,
And the source was tariffs. So you wanted to have
yes,
free
correct.
trade. You wanted to have a navy. You needed to start. It was like, we don't want a navy and army. Standing armies are bad because the British standing army would just come in and say,
Exactly.
we're taking over your house.
Yeah.
Which is in one of the earlier articles. So they're like, that's bad. We don't have one. And then it's like, well, gee, you know what? That Shays Rebellion, they won a couple battles.
Yeah,
Everybody was armed. They got together and said, they're using whiskey as currency, and they put like a 20% tax on it. And they said, we can't even live with that. And we're not paying it. And then Washington the first guys got defeated, and he had to come and put some other troops together. And I mean, he was fighting other Revolutionary War veterans. So
he had to come out of retirement to do that.
he had to, I mean, he was such a unifying force at that time. It's hard to think of now.
Yeah, exactly.
He did have all the factions were together, but it was very deliberate. He was presided over the Constitutional Convention without saying anything.
Yes.
He took no position on any of the issues in front of him.
Oh, he did one.
Did he on one?
Yes. Throughout most of the summer, they had agreed that there should be no more than one representative for every 40,000 people. And at the last minute, Washington spoke up and said, you know what, we should change that to 30,000. And then everybody said, okay.
Yeah.
So that's how we got 30,000.
It's just an extraordinary restraint to me of the guy who some wanted to be king, some of the winning revolutionary our side, that he would not even try to influence the whole process. It's just, I mean, can you imagine someone today doing that? It's just, and that's why it's like, what did he say? Well, there was no minutes or secretary. There's just different notes. I suppose he said we're in session. They always open with a prayer, and I think they closed with one.
Yeah.
And called on people and made rulings from the chair, and nobody knew really what his position was on a lot of this stuff.
Probably kept it as civil as he could.
Well, and that's the brilliance of it is, as soon as you stake out one position on one issue, you've now alienated the people on the other side.
Yes.
And they go, it happens in law all the time. Well, that judge, he's a creditor judge, or he's a defense judge, or
Yeah.
he rules for the government, and that would just have destroyed his effectiveness. But the temptation would be pretty great.
Mhm. Yeah, would have. That would have. All right. Well, Article 7 is the end of the original Constitution before we had amendments. And Article 7 establishes how the Constitution is going to be ratified. So it was going to take 9 states to ratify the Constitution. We could go into some history here on how Articles of Confederation required unanimous consent and how they had to change the rules and all of that. Honestly, if you want to know a ton more of that about that, we have talked about that in length in our Article 5 talks. But the main thing that I always take away from Article 7 is the fact that the states were the ones with the authority to ratify. And that was that. And I think that's something that we forget a lot in today's political culture, is the fact that the states ultimately are the ones with the authority, which is, of course, why we are here.
Yeah, well, it's, as we all know, it's, I mean, in some ways it would have to change, but not in ways that have done. I'm 100% sure, I'll bet Don agrees with me. The founders anticipated regular impeachments of federal judges.
Yes. Yeah.
They did not have this set up that the Supreme Court was going to be making constitutional rulings every other day. And that, I mean, they're writing, we had a Supreme Court justice say that, well, we could use foreign law
Yeah.
to guide us, which is completely unconstitutional. And what they should have done is, I think there's only been like 8 in our history, 8 federal judges, maybe 12. That's a,
But no Supreme Court justices.
no Supreme Court. I don't know if they're in, I think they're all, well, there was only, the justices were the federal court. They rode to the states, and they were the federal district judge and the Court of Appeals and the Supreme Court. They were doing like all of it right in the beginning. So some of these, this is along that line. I think Article 5 is something that Mason certainly anticipated would have been used earlier in the expansion of the federal government than it has been. And that was the great thing, is the power comes from the people. The preamble of the Constitution was, the power is vested in the people. So the people are, in this constitutional instrument, are giving our power for these purposes, to protect the rights that were given by our Creator. And the constitutional ignorance is staggering. I'm talking about in Congress and in Lansing. A bunch of them haven't spent as much time as anybody watching these videos has in looking at the Constitution.
Actually, I wanted to bring up, because it came up when we were going through Article 3, I believe, that there was a Supreme Court justice impeached. It was Associate Justice Samuel Chase in 1805. However, he was acquitted by the Senate. So technically he was impeached, but he wasn't convicted.
Yes. And he wasn't removed from office.
Right.
Right. I don't know. I think they let that one failure discourage him, Don.
So what about the ratification? It was kind of new to think that the Constitution called for ratifying conventions, which was a little different than the norm back then. So what was their method of ratifying conventions versus other modes of ratification?
It was in that book too that I read. A lot of them were conventions. A lot of the state governments were run more by convention. The conventions had the authority to legislate, because of this tension of, we don't want those SOBs in Richmond, Virginia, telling us what to do. And because people are the source of the power, we want it there. So it was very much decentralized in a lot of the states that played into this dynamic of wanting a strong executive. And they're like, we don't want the strong executive because the British, what were they, regent, what, I forget the term, the governors, the royal governors
Yeah.
would name all the judges, all the whatever. If you wanted to be the guy, it's like Matthew the tax collector. You
Yeah.
got a commission. If you wanted to be the tax thing, you had to give more money to the governor. So it was very corrupt, and they did not want that strong executive. And then he got into this who can vote, and this, well, we don't want just the rich plantation owners that got sent to Richmond to be calling the shots. We're just more survival. If we don't have 150 slaves on our farm. And they said we have to have conventions, which was unruly. But some of the state constitutions said they were the only ones that could enact the law.
The conventions can enact the law, you mean?
Yes.
Ah.
Or they had to ratify it. So it was fairly common. But it's not the population we're dealing with. And again, you're talking about none of the slaves could vote, none of the women could vote. And in spite of that, a bunch of them wanted to constrict it narrower. Well, we don't want every white guy to vote. We don't want, It's fascinating how the tensions were resolved, and quite, I think, divinely inspired that it was done so peacefully, up to date, not counting 1861.
So what, just personally having gone through this, I know you've all gone through this, what I kind of like to go around, what do you think is the primary takeaway for you from this section of the Constitution when it comes to relevance to today, for people today? Tyler, what do you think?
I would say probably the biggest, I guess, observation I have about this is maybe the relation between, sanctuary cities that you see popping up in some of these particular strongholds across the country, and how that relates to what would be Article 4, the guarantee clause. I think that's in relevance to that. I'd say that's probably the biggest concern I have right now.
Anyone want to comment on that?
I guess my take is they spent a lot of time trying to make sure that everybody was equal. Even though we have these different states, they're kind of their own sovereign state. But I think what the Constitution generated was a sort of a universal citizen, like a general citizenship. And that a particular state could not take that away or harm you in any way once you become an actual citizen, regardless of which state. So I think that's the stronghold that we just take for granted these days. So the Constitution did its job as far as citizens go between the different states. We've sort of diluted the state lines a little bit, but we have general citizenship because of the 4th article.
I think it's, for me, the checks and balances are multi-layered. You got big state, little state, you've got all of the different, we want an executive, we want the House, we want the Congress, no, we want the House this way, we want the Senate that way. There were many, many proposals of how to have these determined, whether they have 2 bodies of a legislature, whether they have, and if you look at the Federalist Papers, they looked at every type of republic. I think was Jefferson or Franklin, but they had all the books, every book about the
Jefferson.
Jefferson had everything on the Greek republics, the Roman Republic, the Venetian Republic, anything that was a republic for 5 years. He had that book. They looked it all up, and they're trying to learn from the past.
Yeah.
Dealing with what's in the present. And the magnificent part is anticipating the future here, where this is a self-correcting document. It contains within it the provisions for correcting it.
Yeah.
And as you have the blue ink on servitude and things that were just thrown out, the income tax amendment through 16 threw out that the taxes had to be equal by population, and 17 threw out direct election or legislative election of senators. And so it's been amended and changed, and it was designed to be that way. And that, I think, is probably the most brilliant thing. It's not just we got this and that. We got all kinds of big state, little states, slave, free, rural, urban, coast, inland, farmers, traders. All of these people were there with, it wasn't all roses and pussycats. I mean, there were very serious discussions. And again, Mason got this put in unanimously on the 15th, was it, Don? And they were done on the 17th, and he voted no. It was too much. I forget. Do you think it was too much executive power?
Oh yeah, he did not like the executive branch being so strong. Not only that, but he really called for a Bill of Rights. He was so disappointed that there was no Bill of Rights inside the Constitution. So he would cut off his right arm, then sign it.
Yeah, and a lot of them basically were kind of told, we'll come back and do that. And then where Madison's cited as being opposed to a convention of states is, what he said is he didn't want to have another constitutional convention 2 years
That's
later.
right. Exactly.
He wanted to put the Bill of Rights in. And the opposition to the Bill of Rights isn't what was in it. It was like, that's assumed. The more to my earlier point, the more words you put in and the more stuff you put in there, the more you get. Now we have this made up division between political speech and commercial speech. That's not in the First Amendment. That's court created baloney.
Yeah.
That's caused a lot of our problems, and McCain-Feingold and a bunch of the other things. So, I mean, I don't know who was right. I don't know who was right in terms of putting it in there and not putting. When you see how they could have ignored the 9th and 10th Amendment, maybe they were right to put it in there.
Yeah.
And Jim, what would you throw out there?
Just the creation of this supreme law of our lands, this way of formally putting it together, regardless of anything claiming opposition to it. I mean, it's just amazing what they accomplished anyways.
Yeah. Don, did you have anything else you wanted to put out there?
I do, but I'll save it for next week.
Oh, you're such a tease. This guy is such a tease. I'm telling you.
You're going to have to log in next week, Kurt. And, pay attention.
Bill of Rights next week?
Yeah.
Bill of Rights next week. Thank you for all of those of you who have stuck with us this long. If you're watching this live or if you're watching the replay, we are going to be covering Bill of Rights next week. Same time, same place, Tuesday, October 15th, 7:30. We'll go for about an hour. First 10 amendments. Dawn is ready. So we're gonna be back here doing it. It's gonna be a good time. Make sure you download the Constitution if you haven't already. And before we close, I'd like to take a moment and pray, and then I'll let y'all get back to your evening. Father, I just want to thank you for the opportunity we have to do this, that we live in a country that gives us the freedom to have these sorts of conversations. And Father, I ask that you would be with all of those out there that are suffering from the hurricane that recently came through our country, as well as with those who are preparing for the next one. Father, we ask that your hand would be with their families, and that you would just bless them, Father, and protect them, Father. And we ask that you would be with us in Michigan, with our team, with all of the viewers of this, Father, that you would give us all wisdom and how to pursue our lives in a way that will make this country a great place. We thank you and we praise you, Father. Amen.
Amen.
All righty.
Are we off?
We're
Almost.